The alarm cut through the quiet of the Meridian relay station like a blade through silk. Veorlin was halfway through a bowl of warm nutrient broth when the console beside her chair flashed a deep red. She set the bowl down without looking at it. In 11 years of service, she had never seen that particular shade of red before. It was not the color for a passing comet, or a fuel leak, or a minor equipment failure. It was the color reserved for something the station's systems could not classify at all. "Report," she said, already moving toward the command deck. Tamsi Krell was already there, her 4 slender fingers dancing across a curved panel of light. The young Kaeth analyst had a reputation for being unshakable, the kind of person who could recite orbital equations while the room shook around her. But tonight her antennae were pressed flat against her skull, a sign of alarm that no training could hide. "A signal," Tamsi said. "It came from the edge of the Vera expanse. Nothing out there should be broadcasting anything. There are no colonies, no beacons, no ships registered in that region for the last 200 years. Then what is broadcasting? I don't know, but it repeats. Every 6 minutes. Exactly. And it is old. Older than anything we have on file." Vey leaned over the panel and watched the waveform pulse across the screen, rising and falling in a pattern that felt deliberate, almost like breathing. She had spent her whole career on the quiet edges of Concord space, and quiet edges did not usually produce mysteries like this. "Pull up the archive," she said. "Cross-reference the frequency." Tamsi's fingers moved faster. The screen flickered, and then a single file appeared, buried under layers of old classification codes. The title alone made the room feel colder. Terran Signal Class. Unconfirmed. Do not approach. Draven Oss, the station's security chief, stepped onto the deck at that exact moment, his heavy boots striking the metal floor with a sound like distant thunder. He was Voss, broad-shouldered and built for endurance, and he had the look of someone who had already guessed what was on the screen before he saw it. "Say it isn't what I think it is," he said. "We don't know what it is," Vey answered, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. Draven crossed his arms. Every cadet in the Concorde grows up hearing the story. Sailors who vanish near old signal patterns like that one. Ships that go dark and are never found. My grandmother used to say the Terrans were the reason the stars go quiet in some corners of the galaxy. A story to keep children from wandering. A story, Tamsi repeated, her tone careful. Not a record. There has never been a confirmed encounter. Not once. There have been unconfirmed ones, Draven said. That's different from none. Vey held up a hand before the two of them could fall into an old argument neither of them could win. She had heard the myth 100 times growing up on her homeworld, whispered around evening fires, used to explain every unexplained disappearance for centuries. The Terrans were said to be a hidden and violent species, blamed for entire outposts vanishing without a trace, blamed for wars that no historian could properly document, blamed for anything the Concorde could not otherwise explain. Over time, the stories had become so exaggerated that scholars stopped taking them seriously at all. A myth was a myth, and this was, by every official record, one of the oldest and least reliable myths the Concorde possessed. And yet the signal kept repeating, patient and exact, every 6 minutes, as if something on the other end were waiting to be answered. "Options," Vey said. "We report it and let the council decide," Tamsi offered. "That takes weeks," Draven said. "Messages to the council and back take time we might not have. If something out there is broadcasting, it already knows we exist. We are the ones sitting in the dark." "Then we send a probe," Vey said. "Unmanned. No risk to any crew. It gathers data and returns. Nothing more." Draven did not look convinced, but he did not argue either. In matters like this, caution usually won, even against a Voss's instinct to act. Tamsi was already preparing the launch sequence, her earlier fear folding neatly into focus, the way it always did when there was work to be done. 3 hours later, the probe launched from the station's lower bay, a small silver shape disappearing into the dark toward the edge of the Vera expanse. Vey watched its trail on the main display until it faded from view, and she found herself holding her breath without realizing it. For 2 days, nothing happened. The probe sent back routine telemetry, nothing unusual, drifting steadily through empty space exactly as planned. Vey began to relax, allowing herself to believe that the signal had been some strange natural phenomenon after all. A fold in space, an old relay malfunctioning, anything but the myth Draven feared. Then, on the third day, the probe's feed went dark. Not damaged. Not destroyed. Simply gone, as if someone had reached out and turned it off. The command deck fell into a heavy silence. Tamsi ran diagnostics 3 times, checking every possible malfunction, every possible explanation that did not involve the story she had grown up dismissing. Each time, the result was the same. The probe had not failed. It had stopped transmitting the instant it crossed into a region of space the old records marked with a single warning symbol. A symbol so old that half the station's translation database could not even define it properly anymore. It could still be functioning, Tamsi said, though her voice had lost its earlier confidence. It might simply be out of range. It isn't out of range, Draven said quietly. Something is blocking it. Or something took it. Vey stared at the last known coordinates on the screen, a small point of light suspended in the void, the place where their probe had vanished without a struggle, without a warning, without a single clue. She thought of the myth again, the whispered stories from her childhood, the same phrase repeated across 100 different worlds and 100 different languages. They said the Terrans were not evil. They said the Terrans were simply unknowable, and that unknowable things were the most dangerous of all. "We are not sending another probe," she said finally. "We are sending people." Draven's eyes narrowed. "You want to fly into the one place every old story tells us to avoid?" "I want answers," Vey said. "A myth cannot hide from a real crew forever. Either there is nothing out there and we return with proof to finally end centuries of fear, or there is something out there and we need to know exactly what it is before it decides to come looking for us instead." Tamsi looked between them, her antennae slowly rising back to their normal position, curiosity beginning to outweigh her fear. "I want to go," she said. "If this is real, I want to be the one who documents it properly. No more guesses, no more stories passed down without proof." Draven exhaled slowly, the sound almost a growl. "If we're doing this, I'm coming too. Someone has to keep both of you alive if the stories turn out to be true." Vey allowed herself a small, tired smile. It was the first time in days that the tension in the room had eased even slightly. "Then we requisition a scout vessel," she said. "Small crew, fast engines, full sensor suite. We leave within the week." The message went out to the Concord Council that evening, brief and carefully worded, describing an anomalous signal at the edge of known space, and a decision to investigate directly. Vey did not mention the old myth by name. She did not need to. Anyone reading the report with even a passing knowledge of history would understand exactly what she was suggesting, and exactly how many people would think she had lost her mind for suggesting it. She stood alone on the observation deck later that night, watching the stars beyond the station's reinforced viewport, the same stars that had watched over 1,000 generations of Concord explorers before her. Somewhere out there, past the edge of everything they understood, something had reached across the dark and touched their world for just long enough to prove it was real. Whether it was a myth finally stepping into the light, or something else entirely, Vey did not know. But she understood, standing there in the quiet hum of the station, that whatever waited for them at the edge of the Vera expanse was about to change everything the Concord believed about the universe, and about themselves. The signal pulsed again in the distance, patient as ever, 6 minutes exactly since the last one. Vey watched the light blink across her wrist display and felt, for the first time in her long career, something she rarely allowed herself to feel. She felt afraid, and beneath that fear, quietly, she felt something else too. She felt curious. 3 days later, the scout vessel Kestrel launched from Meridian Relay Station under a sky full of watching stars, carrying 3 crew members and centuries of unanswered questions toward the one place the galaxy had always been too afraid to look. The Kestrel dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a shudder that rattled every loose bolt on the ship, and Ress Talvi, the pilot, swore under her breath as the console in front of her lit up with more warnings than she had ever seen at once. "We're here," she said, "wherever here actually is." Captain Yonade leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the viewport. Veorlan stood behind him, gripping the back of his seat, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge said a word. Ahead of them, framed by the black of space, hung a blue and green world, wrapped in white clouds, turning slowly and silently, as if it had been waiting there for a very long time. It was beautiful, in a way none of them expected, and it was also, according to every record the Concorde possessed, a place that should not exist. "Confirm the coordinates," Vey said quietly. "Confirmed," Tamsi answered from the science station, her voice tight with disbelief. "This is the source of the signal. This is where our probe stopped transmitting, and it's inhabited. I'm reading power signatures across the surface. Cities, communication networks. This isn't an empty system. This is a living world." Draven stood near the back of the bridge, arms crossed, watching the planet with an expression that gave nothing away. "The myth," he said, "was never about an empty system." Nobody answered him, because nobody had a better explanation. For the next 2 hours, the crew of the Kestrel observed the planet in careful silence, cataloging everything they could from a safe distance. Radio broadcasts poured out from the surface in hundreds of different languages, some clearly ancient, some strikingly new. Satellites orbited the planet in numbers that suggested a species deeply concerned with watching both their skies and each other. Military vessels moved along familiar patrol routes near several coastlines, and scattered among the noise, faint but unmistakable, was the same repeating signal that had first drawn them across the galaxy, broadcasting steadily from a single point on the planet's surface, as if it were a lighthouse built specifically to be found. "It's not a warning," Tamsi said suddenly. "The signal. I don't think it's a warning at all. I think it's an invitation." "Or a trap," Draven said. "Or curiosity," Vey said. "The same curiosity that brought us here." They debated their next move for nearly an hour. Draven argued for a careful, unannounced approach, staying hidden until they understood more. Tamsi argued for direct contact, insisting that hiding would only delay the inevitable and risk making first contact look like an act of aggression. Yoon, as captain, listened to both of them before finally turning to Vey, who had been quiet through most of the discussion. "You brought us here," he said. "What do you want to do?" Vey looked at the planet turning slowly beyond the viewport, thinking of the myth that had shaped so much of her early life, the fear passed down through generations, without a single confirmed fact to support it. "I want to know the truth," she said, "and the only way to know it is to ask." They chose a location near a coastal research facility, a place where the signal originated, and where satellite scans showed relatively few military assets nearby. Res guided the Kestrel down through the atmosphere with practiced care, the ship's outer hull glowing faintly from the friction of entry, until they landed in a wide-open field just beyond the edge of the facility's outer fence. The reaction from the ground was immediate. Lights flared on across the facility. Vehicles raced toward the perimeter. Figures in dark uniforms spread out along the fence line, weapons raised but not fired, forming a careful and disciplined barrier between the strange craft and the buildings behind them. Vey watched it all through the Kestrel's external sensors, struck by how quickly the humans had organized themselves. There was no panic in their movements, no chaos, just fast, coordinated caution. "They're not attacking," Draven said, surprised. "They're watching," Vey said. "Same as we would." After nearly 20 minutes of tense stillness, a small group of unarmed figures approached the ship on foot, walking slowly, hands visible, moving with the careful deliberation of people who understood exactly how dangerous the moment was and had chosen to face it anyway. At their front walked a woman with steady eyes and an even steadier stride, flanked by a man carrying nothing but a small handheld device that appeared to be some form of recording equipment. "That's our opening," Vey said. "Lower the ramp." Draven's jaw tightened. "You want to walk out there first?" "I want them to see that we came to talk," Vey said, "not to hide." She stepped down the ramp alone, her hands open at her sides, moving slowly across the grass, toward the small group waiting at the edge of the field. Behind her, she could hear Draven's heavy footsteps following at a careful distance, close enough to protect her, far enough not to appear threatening. Tamsi remained on the ship, monitoring every word that was about to be exchanged, ready to translate the moment real communication became possible. The woman at the front of the human group stopped a short distance away, studying Vey with an expression that held far more curiosity than fear. Up close, She looked younger than Vey expected, her dark hair pulled back, her clothing simple and practical, marked with a small emblem Vey did not recognize. "My name is Grace Holloway," the woman said slowly, her voice carrying clearly across the open field. "I don't know if you understand me, but you're welcome to lower whatever you're holding, because we've lowered ours." Vey's translator, a small device resting against her collar, processed the words a half-second behind the sound, rendering them into her own language with careful precision. She felt something loosen in her chest at the sound of it, a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. "I understand you," Vey said, and watched Grace's eyes widen slightly as the translated words came through a small speaker built into Vey's suit. "My name is Vey Orlan. We came a very long way to find you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently across the field, carrying the smell of grass and rain, an ordinary and unremarkable smell that somehow made the entire scene feel more surreal. "We picked up your signal," Vey continued. "We didn't know what it was. We still aren't entirely sure. But we wanted to understand it before deciding it was something to fear." Grace glanced briefly at the man beside her, some silent understanding passing between them, before turning back to Vey. "That signal has been broadcasting for almost 3 years, she said. "We didn't expect anyone to actually answer it. Most people here stopped believing anyone would." "You built it hoping someone would come?" Vey asked. "We built it hoping we weren't alone," Grace said simply. "There's a difference." Behind Grace, the man with the recording device spoke for the first time, his voice quieter, more cautious. "Ethan Pierce," he said. "I work with the government here. I have to ask, directly, whether you're the first of many, or whether this is everyone you brought." Vey appreciated the bluntness of the question, the same kind of directness Draven often used when he wanted an answer without decoration. "There are 3 of us on the ship," she said. "No more are coming unless we send word that it's safe to." Ethan nodded slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing at the answer, though not all of it. "That's the right thing to say to keep us calm," he said. "Doesn't mean it's true." "It's true," Vey said. "But I understand why you doubt it. We doubted whether you existed at all until 3 days ago." For the first time, something like a smile crossed Grace's face, small and careful, but genuine. "Well," she said, "we're very real, and apparently, so are you." Over the following hours, the initial tension slowly gave way to something more structured. A larger delegation arrived from further inland, bringing with them a woman named Laura Finch, introduced as a senior diplomatic officer, calm and measured in a way that suggested she had prepared for a moment like this for most of her career, even if she had never truly believed it would come. Alongside her walked a physicist named Daniel Marsh, whose barely contained excitement kept slipping through his professional composure every time he glanced toward the kestrel resting in the field behind them. They spoke through the night, questions moving in both directions, careful and deliberate. The humans wanted to understand where the Concorde had come from, how many worlds it contained, how long it had existed, and why, out of all the stars in their sky, this signal had drawn a response after so many years of silence. Vey and her crew, in turn, found themselves fascinated by the sheer contradictions on display. The humans were guarded, yet endlessly curious. Careful, yet quick to offer warmth once the first barrier of fear had passed. Laura Finch spoke with the practiced calm of someone managing a delicate negotiation, while Daniel Marsh asked increasingly excited questions about the Kestrel's engines, until Ethan gently reminded him that questions about weapons systems were not part of tonight's agenda. By the time the sky began to lighten toward dawn, something unspoken had shifted between the two groups. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that resembled it. "Tomorrow," Laura said finally, as the meeting drew to a close, "our leadership will want a formal exchange. Something official, something recorded. I imagine your people will want the same." "They will," Vey said, "and they'll want proof that this world is exactly what it appears to be." "And what does it appear to be?" Grace asked. Vey considered the question carefully before answering, watching the first light of sunrise spread slowly across the field, painting the grass and the distant buildings in soft gold. "A myth," she said, "one that turned out to be far more complicated and far more human than anyone back home ever imagined." As the Kestrel's crew returned to their ship that morning, Draven walked beside Vey in silence for a long stretch of the field before finally speaking. "They're not what the stories said," he admitted. "No," Vey agreed. "They're something else entirely. Better or worse." Vey glanced back toward the distant lights of the research facility, thinking of Grace's steady eyes, Ethan's cautious honesty, Laura's careful diplomacy, and the quiet excitement barely hidden beneath Daniel's professional questions. She thought of an entire species capable of fear and curiosity in equal measure, capable of raising weapons and lowering them within the same hour, capable of building a signal for years without knowing if anyone would ever answer it. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I think we're about to find out." Behind them, the ship's communication array quietly transmitted a full report back toward Concord space, a message that would take days to arrive and would trigger a storm of debate the moment it did. For now, though, on a quiet field bathed in early morning light, two very different worlds had simply chosen, for the first time in recorded history, to talk instead of run. 6 days after the Kestrel's report reached Concord space, the council chamber on the capital world of Illyra Prime was louder than it had been in over a century. Tamsi Krell had never seen the chamber in person before, only in recordings shown during her early education, and she found the reality far more overwhelming than any recording had prepared her for. Delegates from a dozen member species filled the tiered seating, their voices overlapping in a dozen different languages before the translation systems could smooth them into something coherent. At the center of it all stood Vey Orlan, calm as ever, presenting the findings from Earth to a room full of people who seemed determined not to believe a word of it. "You are asking us to accept," said a delegate from the Zeth Collective, his voice sharp with disbelief, "that the species responsible for the disappearance of 11 Concord vessels over the last 3 centuries is not only real, but that you walked among them and returned unharmed." "I am asking you to accept the evidence," Vey said evenly, "not the myth. The evidence shows a species capable of both remarkable caution and remarkable openness. Nothing in our observations supports the idea that they are responsible for those disappearances. And yet the myth persists precisely because of those disappearances," the delegate pressed. "Myths do not grow from nothing." It was at this point that Tamsi stepped forward, her research notes displayed on the chamber's central screen, months of careful work compressed into a single presentation she had prepared during the long journey home. "With respect," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I began digging into the origin of the Terran myth the moment we identified the signal. What I found does not support the idea of an aggressive, hidden species deliberately destroying our ships. It suggests something far more specific and far more limited than the story most of us grew up believing." She brought up an old star chart, faded and partially reconstructed from fragments recovered in the Concord's oldest archives, dated nearly 400 years earlier. "This is the record of the scout vessel Halworth Drift, the earliest documented source of the Terran myth. According to the surviving logs, the Halworth Drift encountered an unknown vessel near what we now believe to be the outer edge of Earth's solar system. The encounter was brief, and according to the fragments we recovered, it was the Halworth Drift that fired first, mistaking a defensive maneuver for an attack." A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber. "The Halworth Drift did not survive the encounter," Tamsi continued. "Its final transmission blamed an unprovoked assault by an unknown hostile species. That transmission became the foundation of everything we now call the Terran myth. Every disappearance since then, every unexplained loss near that region of space, was folded into the same story, whether or not it had any actual connection to Earth." "You're suggesting the myth began with our own mistake," said a Kaeth elder seated near the front, her tone more curious than hostile. "I'm suggesting the myth began with an incomplete record," Tamsi said. "One frightened crew, one violent misunderstanding, and 400 years of storytelling filling in the gaps with fear instead of facts." The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet, broken eventually by Draven Oss, who had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, but now rose from his seat near the back of the room. "I want to be clear," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the chamber, "that I went into this expedition believing the myth. I grew up on stories that made the Terrans sound like something to fear before we even understood what they were. What I saw on that planet was a species capable of raising weapons in defense, yes, but also capable of lowering them the moment we offered them a reason to trust us. That is not the behavior the myth describes. That is the behavior of people who are, frankly, a great deal like us. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. Then, slowly, the debate began again, quieter this time, more thoughtful, the anger of a few minutes earlier giving way to something closer to genuine consideration. It was not unanimous. It was rarely unanimous, in a chamber built from a dozen different cultures, each carrying their own version of caution and fear. But by the end of the session, the Council agreed to authorize a formal diplomatic mission to Earth, one built on careful, structured contact, rather than the myth-driven suspicion that had defined the Concord's relationship with that corner of the galaxy for centuries. Not everyone in the chamber was satisfied with that outcome. Later that evening, in a private meeting room, several levels below the main chamber, a smaller group gathered away from the public record. Among them sat a delegate named Corin Vask, a senior member of the Voss Military Council, a man Draven had known and respected for most of his career, though tonight, Draven was not present to see the expression on Corin's face as the meeting began. "The Council has made its decision," said one of the delegates present, a Zeth strategist with a reputation for caution, bordering on paranoia. But decisions made in fear of appearing hostile are rarely wise ones. "You think the myth was accurate after all," Corin said. "I think," the strategist replied carefully, "that a species capable of building weapons strong enough to threaten a scout vessel 400 years ago has had 400 years to grow stronger since. I think a species that built a signal, specifically designed to draw attention, understands exactly how dangerous that attention could become. And I think the Council, in its rush to appear open-minded, is walking blindly into a relationship with a species we barely understand, based on the word of a handful of officers who spent less than a full day on the ground." Corin considered this in silence for a long moment. He had spent his entire career defending Concord space from threats both real and imagined, and the idea of an unknown, potentially dangerous species gaining formal recognition without proper caution sat uneasily with him. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "Not open conflict," the strategist said. "Nothing so reckless. Simply a test, a controlled situation, arranged to look like an unfortunate misunderstanding, that will reveal the true nature of this species, before we commit the entire Concord to an alliance we cannot undo. If they respond with restraint, our fears are unfounded, and the Council's diplomatic mission proceeds with proper confidence. If they respond with aggression, we will have proven exactly what the myth always warned us about, before it becomes too late to protect ourselves. And if the Council discovers what we've done, they won't," the strategist said, "not if it's handled carefully. And even if they do, they will understand, eventually, that some decisions are too important to leave entirely in the hands of diplomats who have never had to clean up the consequences of being wrong." Corin did not agree immediately. He asked for time to consider it, time the strategist granted with visible reluctance. But over the following days, as reports continued to arrive detailing the enthusiasm building around the upcoming diplomatic mission, a quiet unease continued to grow in him. The same unease that had shaped his entire career. The belief that caution, however uncomfortable, had kept the Concord safe for longer than any diplomat's optimism ever could. Meanwhile on Earth, the days following first contact moved with a strange mixture of urgency and wonder. Grace Holloway found herself at the center of an entirely new kind of work, translating not just language but entire ways of thinking, spending long hours with Vey and Tamsi trying to bridge gaps that went far deeper than vocabulary. Ethan Pierce oversaw security arrangements that grew more elaborate by the day, balancing the government's caution with the undeniable fact that the visitors had, so far, given them no real reason for alarm. Laura Finch worked tirelessly on the framework for a formal agreement, something that would define how humanity approached its first true relationship with another civilization among the stars. And Daniel Marsh, true to his nature, spent every spare moment he could steal, peppering Tamsi with questions about Concord technology, occasionally receiving patient answers, occasionally receiving a polite but firm reminder that certain topics required more trust before they could be discussed. "You're taking all of this remarkably well," Grace said to Vey one evening, as the two of them walked along the edge of the research facility under a darkening sky. A little over a week ago, your people thought mine were a myth. Now you're preparing formal treaties. We move carefully when we can, Vey said. But sometimes the universe doesn't wait for careful. Sometimes it simply arrives, and you either meet it honestly, or you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if you had. Grace considered this for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the distant hills. For what it's worth, she said, I think you made the right choice. Meeting us honestly, I mean. Vey allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. So do I, she said, though I suspect not everyone back home shares that opinion. She did not know, standing there under Earth's darkening sky, just how right she was. Nor did she know that hundreds of light years away, in a quiet meeting room far from any official record, a plan was already taking shape, one designed specifically to test the very trust she had worked so hard to build, and to prove, one way or another, that the old myth had never truly been wrong at all. The signal that had once seemed like a simple invitation now carried a weight neither Vey nor Grace could yet fully understand, a fragile thread connecting two worlds that had spent centuries believing the other did not exist. And somewhere in the space between them, a decision was forming that would determine whether that thread held, or whether it would snap, under the weight of fear that refused to let go, even in the face of undeniable truth. The trap was set 11 days later, disguised as nothing more than a routine supply run. Corin Vask had chosen his method carefully. A single unmarked vessel, stripped of any official Voss or Concord identification, would approach Earth's outer defense perimeter under the cover of a scheduled equipment transfer between the Kestrel and a second support ship that had recently arrived to assist with the ongoing diplomatic mission. At the last moment, the unmarked vessel would deviate from its approved course, moving directly toward one of Earth's coastal cities under the guise of a malfunction, close enough to trigger every alarm on the planet's early warning systems. If humanity responded with panic, with overwhelming force, with the kind of unrestrained aggression the old myth had always warned against, Corin would have his proof, and if they responded with restraint, he told himself, then perhaps the strategist's fears would prove unfounded after all, and no real harm would come of it. He told himself this often in the days leading up to the operation, though he never quite managed to believe it completely. On the ground, Ethan Pierce was the first to notice the deviation, watching the tracking display in the command center with a growing knot of tension in his chest. That's not on the approved flight path, he said, leaning closer to the screen. It changed course 4 minutes ago, and it's accelerating. Laura Finch appeared at his side almost instantly, her earlier calm replaced by sharp focus. Get Vey on the line, she said. Now. Vey answered within seconds, her voice tight even through the translator. We see it, she said. It isn't one of ours, not officially. Whatever it is, it broke away from an approved supply corridor, and it's heading straight for you. Can you stop it? We're trying, Vey said. Draven's already moving to intercept, but the Kestrel isn't built for this kind of speed. You need to prepare for the possibility that we don't reach it in time. In the command center, alarms had begun sounding across the region, the same alarms that had trained an entire generation to expect the worst from unexpected objects in the sky. Military channels filled with rapid, clipped voices. Interceptor aircraft were scrambled from 3 separate bases. And for a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed as though the very worst version of this encounter was about to unfold exactly as Corin had hoped it might, proving the ancient fear correct, through nothing more than a manufactured crisis, dressed up as an accident. But something unexpected happened instead. Grace Holloway, still present in the command center working alongside Ethan, was the first to notice the pattern in the unmarked vessel's trajectory. It's not aiming for the city, she said suddenly, studying the display closely. Look at the angle. If it continues on this path, it's going to pass just north of the coastline, over open water. It's close, but it's not on a collision course with anything populated. Ethan frowned, following her line of sight. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, Grace admitted. But if I'm right, and we respond by shooting it down over inhabited land instead of letting it pass, we're the ones creating the disaster, not them. It was Laura who made the final call, standing between two impossible choices with the weight of an entire species' first true crisis resting on her judgment. She turned to the ranking military officer present, her voice steady despite the tension radiating through the room. "Redirect the interceptors," she said. "Escort formation only. No offensive action, unless that vessel changes course toward populated ground. We give it room to pass." "That's a significant risk," the officer said. "So is starting a conflict with a species we barely understand, based on an object that might simply be malfunctioning," Laura said. "We watch. We escort. We hold our fire, unless there's no other choice." The interceptors adjusted their formation, flying alongside the unmarked vessel at a careful distance, weapons armed, but silent, ready, without being aggressive. On board the Kestrel, Draven pushed the small ship's engines harder than they were rated for, closing the distance, just as the unmarked vessel began to waver, its earlier deliberate course suddenly less certain, as if whoever was piloting it had not expected humanity's response to look quite like this. "They're not panicking," Draven said through gritted teeth, watching the human interceptors hold their careful formation on his display. "They're escorting it, giving it room." Whatever Corin Vask had expected to see when he watched the operation unfold from a secure relay station outside Concord space, it was not this. He had expected fire, chaos, the kind of unrestrained response that would justify every warning his career had been built upon. Instead, he watched a species meet an unexplained threat with careful, disciplined restraint, holding a line between defense and aggression, with a precision that unsettled him more deeply than outright hostility ever could have. The unmarked vessel, its automated systems finally reaching the end of their programmed deviation, began correcting course back toward open space, exactly as Corin had originally designed it to do once the test concluded. But the test had not gone the way he intended. There was no chaos to point to, no overwhelming aggression to justify his fears, only a species that had chosen, under enormous pressure, to hold back rather than strike first. Draven's voice crackled across every open channel a moment later, sharp with barely restrained anger. "This is Draven Oss of the Concord vessel Kestrel," he said. "I am formally requesting identification of the unmarked vessel currently retreating from Earth's perimeter, and I am formally reporting this incident to the full council the moment I return to Concord space." There was no response from the fleeing ship, only silence, and then, moments later, the quiet confirmation that it had entered a faster-than-light jump, vanishing from every sensor before anyone could intercept it. In the command center on the ground, the tension slowly, carefully, began to ease. Ethan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Grace sat down heavily in the nearest chair, her hands trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. Laura remained standing, her eyes still fixed on the display, watching the last traces of the unmarked vessel's trail fade into nothing. "That wasn't a malfunction," she said quietly. "No," Vay's voice confirmed through the open channel, heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. "It wasn't. It took less than a day for the truth to surface." Draven's formal report, combined with detailed sensor data recovered from the Kestrel and cross-referenced against restricted Concord shipping records, traced the unmarked vessel back to a small, quietly funded operation connected to elements within the Voss Military Council. Corin Vask's name appeared in the investigation within hours, along with several others who had participated in planning what quickly became known, in hushed and embarrassed tones across Concord space, as the Earth incident. Back on Illyra Prime, the council chamber that had once debated the mere existence of humanity now found itself debating something far more uncomfortable: the question of how a faction within their own alliance had nearly destroyed the very trust they were trying so carefully to build. Corin Vask, when questioned, offered no apology, only a quiet, unwavering conviction that his fears had simply been proven correct in a different way than he expected. "I did not see aggression," he admitted before the council, his voice heavy but unrepentant. "I saw restraint. I will admit that. But restraint under pressure does not erase 400 years of unanswered questions. It only means we are dealing with a species disciplined enough to hide whatever else they might be capable of." "Or," Draven said, standing to address the chamber directly, his usual gruffness replaced by something more measured, "it means exactly what it looked like. A species capable of holding back even when provoked, even when frightened, even when every instinct might have told them to strike first." I have spent my entire career believing caution was the same as wisdom. What I saw on that planet, and what I saw in the response to your operation, has made me reconsider exactly how much of that caution was simply fear wearing a more respectable name. The chamber fell silent at that, the weight of his words settling over delegates who had spent centuries treating the Terran myth as an unquestioned truth, never once considering how much of it had been built not on evidence, but on the comfortable certainty of never having to test it. On Earth, the aftermath of the incident left its own mark. Trust, once shaken, does not repair itself easily, and for several tense days following the encounter, the formal diplomatic mission hung in uncertain balance. Ethan pushed for a temporary halt to negotiations, until Concord authorities could guarantee nothing similar would happen again. Laura argued, more carefully, that halting progress now would only prove exactly what people like Corin Vask wanted to believe, that humanity was too fragile, too reactive, to be trusted with the truth of what had actually happened. It was Grace, in the end, who found the words that mattered most. Standing before a small gathering of officials and scientists, still shaken by how close the crisis had come to spiraling into something far worse. "We were tested," she said simply. "Not by all of them. By a small, frightened part of a much larger whole, the same way fear sometimes moves a small, frightened part of us. What matters isn't that the test happened. What matters is how both sides responded once it did." Vey, standing quietly at the back of the room during Grace's speech, found herself thinking of the myth again. The story she had grown up believing without question. The story that had very nearly become a self-fulfilling prophecy through nothing more than fear, given the freedom to act. She thought of Draven's words before the council, of Corin's unwavering certainty even in the face of clear evidence, and of humanity's careful, disciplined restraint, under the exact kind of pressure the old stories had always predicted would reveal their true and violent nature. The myth, she realized, had never truly been about what humanity might do. It had always been about what fear might convince an entire civilization to believe, long before the truth ever had a chance to speak for itself. As the days passed and the formal diplomatic mission slowly resumed, carrying with it a far deeper understanding than either side had possessed before the crisis, Vey found herself standing once again on that same quiet field where she had first met Grace Holloway, the grass now familiar beneath her feet, the sky above no longer a mystery but something closer to a shared horizon. "We almost lost this," she said quietly, watching the sun set behind the distant hills. "But we didn't," Grace said, standing beside her. "And now we know exactly what almost losing it would have cost. Sometimes that's worth more than never being tested at all." Vey nodded slowly, though the weight of the near disaster still sat heavily in her chest. Somewhere behind them, the Kestrel rested quietly on the grass, its hull catching the last light of the setting sun, a small and unremarkable ship that had, against every fearful story ever told about this world, helped prove that the greatest danger the Concord ever faced was never truly the myth of the Terrans at all. It had always been the fear of finding out the myth was wrong. 3 months after the Earth incident, the council chamber on Alira Prime filled once again, but this time the mood carried none of the sharp, defensive tension that had marked every previous session concerning humanity. Delegates from across the Concord took their seats with a kind of quiet anticipation, aware that whatever happened today would settle, formally and permanently, the question that had consumed their politics for months. Vey Orland stood at the center of the chamber once more, though this time she was not alone. Beside her, connected through a live transmission link spanning the vast distance between Earth and Alira Prime, stood Laura Finch, dressed formally, her expression calm despite the enormity of the moment. It was the first time a human representative had addressed the full Concord Council directly, and the chamber had never been quieter. 3 months ago, Laura began, her voice carried clearly through the translation systems, installed specifically for this occasion. An unauthorized operation nearly destroyed the trust between our peoples before it had a real chance to begin. I understand there are those among you who still see that operation as a kind of proof, evidence that caution toward my species remains justified. I would ask you to consider something instead. Consider that the operation failed to produce the outcome its architects expected, not because we got lucky, but because both our peoples chose, in the moment that mattered most, to hold back rather than escalate. She paused, glancing briefly at Vey before continuing. That choice was not inevitable. It could have gone differently, on either side, but it didn't. And I believe that says more about who we actually are than any myth passed down through 400 years of unanswered questions ever could. A Zeth delegate rose from his seat, the same cautious voice that had challenged Vey's original report months earlier. "You speak convincingly," he said, "but convincing words are not the same as certainty. How do we know this restraint was not simply the result of circumstance, rather than character?" "You don't," Laura said honestly. "Not with absolute certainty. No civilization can offer that kind of guarantee about itself, including yours. What we can offer is a demonstrated pattern of behavior, tested under exactly the kind of pressure the myth always warned about, and a genuine willingness to build something better than 400 years of assumption." The chamber remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over delegates who had spent their entire careers treating caution as the safest possible choice. It was Tamsi Krell who spoke next, stepping forward with the same careful precision that had first uncovered the true origin of the Terran myth months earlier. "I want to share something else I found during my continued research," she said. "After the Earth incident, I went back through every recorded encounter ever attributed to the Terran myth. All 11 vessel disappearances, all the unexplained losses stretched across 4 centuries of conquered history. I cross-referenced them against Earth's own historical records their scientists generously shared once formal cooperation began." She brought up a new display, one showing a detailed timeline stretching across 400 years, with markers indicating each Concord loss, alongside corresponding periods of Earth's own technological development. "Of the 11 disappearances," she continued, "only the very first, the Halworth Drift incident, occurred anywhere near Earth's solar system during a period when the species possessed anything resembling the capability to reach that far into space. The remaining 10 disappearances happened during centuries when humanity was still confined entirely to their own world, with no ships, no technology, and no possible way to have been responsible." A murmur spread through the chamber, delegates exchanging glances as the full weight of Tamsi's findings settled over them. "The myth," Tamsi said, "was never really about the Terrans at all. It became a convenient explanation for every mystery the Concord could not otherwise solve, growing larger and more fearsome with each retelling, until an entire species was blamed for centuries of unrelated losses they could not possibly have caused. The truth is far less dramatic, and far more human, if I may borrow a phrase from our new neighbors. Sometimes the universe is simply vast and dangerous on its own, without any need for monsters to explain it." The council debated for the remainder of the day, voices rising and falling across a dozen languages, old fears colliding with new evidence, in ways that no single speech could fully resolve. But as the hours passed, something gradually shifted in the tone of the chamber, the sharp defensiveness of earlier sessions, giving way to something more thoughtful, more willing to sit with uncertainty, rather than resolve it through fear alone. By the time the final vote was called, the outcome, while not unanimous, was clear. The Concord formally recognized Earth as a sovereign civilization, extending an invitation for continued diplomatic relations, cultural exchange, and eventually, should both sides wish it, deeper cooperation across trade, science, and shared defense. Corin Vask, stripped of his military authority following the investigation into the Earth incident, watched the vote from the gallery in silence, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture suggested a man still not fully convinced, even in the face of everything the day had revealed. Draven Oss found him there afterward, lingering near the chamber's tall windows, as the delegates slowly filed out around them. "You still don't believe it," Draven said, not unkindly. "I believe the evidence," Corin said. "I am simply not certain evidence is the same as safety. Perhaps that makes me foolish. Perhaps it simply makes me someone who has spent too long guarding the border to stop watching it, even when the danger turns out to be smaller than expected." Draven considered this for a long moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "I understand that feeling better than you might think. I grew up on the same stories you did. I stood on that field on Earth expecting to find exactly the monster the myth described. What I found instead was a species capable of both fear and courage, in equal measure, same as us. Maybe that's not the same as safety, but I don't think anything in this galaxy ever truly is." Corin did not respond, but he did not argue either, and Draven took that, for now, as the closest thing to progress he was likely to get. Months later, on a quiet stretch of coastline near the original research facility where first contact had begun, a small ceremony took place, modest by Concord standards, but significant enough that representatives from both Earth and the Concord Council traveled great distances to attend. Grace Holloway stood near the front of the gathered crowd, watching as Vay Orlan and Laura Finch signed the final formal agreement between their two civilizations, the culmination of everything that had begun with a single, unexplained signal drifting quietly through the dark edge of known space. "Strange, isn't it?" Grace said afterward, standing beside Vay as the crowd slowly began to disperse into the warm afternoon sun, that all of this started with a story, meant to keep people afraid. "Most important things do," Vay said. "Fear is easy. It fills in the gaps where understanding hasn't reached yet. The hard part is choosing to look past it, even when every old story tells you not to." Grace smiled, watching Daniel Marsh nearby, still peppering Tamsy with an endless stream of questions about Concord engineering. Questions Tamsy now answered with far more patience and far more openness than she once had. Nearby, Ethan Pierce and Draven Oss stood in quiet conversation, two people from entirely different worlds who had somehow, through months of shared tension and shared trust, developed something resembling genuine respect for one another. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now," Vay said, looking out over the wide blue ocean stretching toward the horizon, the same kind of vast unknown that had once made her own people so afraid of exactly this moment. "We keep learning, slowly, carefully, the way anything worth building actually gets built." Far above them, beyond the reach of the afternoon sky, the signal that had started it all still broadcast quietly from its original source, no longer a call sent blindly into the dark, but a steady, ongoing symbol of everything that had changed because two civilizations chose curiosity over fear, restraint over assumption, and truth over the comfortable certainty of an old and frightened myth. The Terrans, it turned out, had never been the monsters the galaxy imagined. They had simply been waiting, quietly and patiently, for someone brave enough to finally ask who they really were. And in the end, that question had changed everything, not because the answer was simple, but because both sides had finally been willing to listen for it.